All right, so the next page in our training is really sort of an overview of the rest of the training. So we've spent some time thus far talking about how God raised up leaders in the past in Scripture, talking about how helpful and necessary it is going to be for us to develop a pipeline and a culture of calling within our own local churches. And maybe with any training, it feels like we have to justify you spending your time to go through this training, and we spend a lot of time just saying, "Hey, this is what God does. This is what God's been doing from the beginning, and if He's not doing it." In your church, it's not because he doesn't want to. It might be because we don't know how to sort of prepare the way for him to do the work that he wants to do. So that's what we've been talking about. Now we're really talking about, okay, how do we identify and what do we need to do with the leaders that we do identify? How do we identify leaders? So on this page, it says at the top, intro to the main themes. And then it says discover who are and where are the leaders and ministries needed. Identify them. So, what we want to do is we want to discover where the leaders are. Because one of the biggest problems that almost every pastor has in every church that I've ever talked to a pastor, this is always a problem they have. We don't have enough leaders. Where do we find them? I remember going to my DS when I was first a lead pastor and saying, "Hey, we need somebody for this thing," and I'm just not sure we have anybody. And our church had a culture of calling where we had always raised up. Staff from within the church, but I was thinking, man, I can't find the person that I really need for this role. And Dr. Fred Huff was my DS at the time, and he was doing a little mentoring with me. And he said, "Well, Pete, the first place to look is within your own local church." And I was like, I've already looked there. Well, it turns out that's where that role was filled from. We continued sort of the culture that we had already had. Um, but I was thinking that I wasn't going to be able to. He did tell me the next place to look would be from other local churches and places that where you know people, and I've since realized that it is much better to find somebody that you know than it is to find somebody that is unknown from who knows where, and I've seen pastors have all sorts of trouble with leaders that they've brought in. I've learned, and maybe I'm doing a little bit of the training ahead of time, but I've learned that it's easier when somebody is already understanding the culture of your church and the mission mindset of your church to teach them to lead sometimes than it is to teach somebody who already knows how to lead and already is experienced to teach them how your church might be different. And so, somebody that already is connected with your church already in some way, somebody that you know and knows you, is always a good thought. But yeah, within our church, I'm doing some teaching already. And then, of course, he said, last resort, outside somewhere. Um, well, we're going to talk more about that in the actual training. Develop. So once we discover them, we need to develop them. Now, let's just say a lot of churches bring in somebody already developed. They want somebody ready to go. I got a call from a pastor one time who wanted to call one of our staff members and ask me, tell me about this person. And I said, well, this person has some great gifts and that sort of thing. But if you're looking for somebody who's ready to go, that is already sort of seasoned, you're looking at the wrong person. This is the sort of person that if you attach them to your hip, if you make sure that they understand your heart and your mission, then they will do great. But you're going to have to develop them. That's what we're working on. We're developing them as we speak, but if you call them, then you're going to be sort of interrupting their development process. So you need to bring them in expecting that you need to finish that development. A lot of pastors I think the known, and they bring in people that are already seasoned and they already know can do the job, and that's not been our luxury. We don't have the funds to bring in pastors, pay their moving costs, pay them what the value is of somebody that's that seasoned a leader. So we look for it from within, and sometimes that feels like a little bit of a curse. But I think it's also a blessing, because what it has done for us is sort of insisted that we develop those who are, and by the way, discipleship, that is our call, to develop the people that come into our church. They are not already going to be mature Christians. They are not already going to be sort of ready to go in a lot of areas. That's the call that we have as the church, is to make disciples where there were none. And so when we start developing people for leadership, there's a sense of urgency because we need leaders. And so we start doing the work that we probably should have already been doing anyway. We start developing people who come into the church. The third that we're going to talk about is deploy the leaders into his mission field. And what that looks like is sometimes that mission field is right in our backyard. Occasionally, that is overseas or in the church next door, or in the district next door. And certainly, we found that when you do a good job of developing leaders, that then there's all sorts of people all around who are not developing leaders themselves, that want your leaders. I had a pastor on our district that was fond of joking with me that she was looking to steal some sheep. And that doesn't sound like a good joke. Didn't sound like a good joke to me. Probably not the right thing to say, but she was always laughing about it because she just was so fond of the leaders in our church. And I stopped her one day and said, "I don't think you would have wanted these leaders when we got them. So you want them because of the work that we've done to develop them. And you don't think you have the leaders that you need. You have ones that are exactly like these ones were before we developed them. So what you need to do is work on developing them." Occasionally, they get deployed to another church from a pastor who is perhaps doesn't feel like they have the time. They need to get the mission accomplished now because they're under some scrutiny, and they need to bring in somebody that's already developed. Perhaps, I know there's a lot of stresses that we're under as pastors, so I don't want to criticize, but I would say that a lot of people are not developing leaders themselves. And therefore, when they're looking for leaders, they're looking for the ones that we have developed, which means that we get to deploy them. And I prefer to deploy them in the mission field that we have right here in our backyard, because the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. But I do have a kingdom mindset and recognize that sometimes they need to be deployed elsewhere, and that's how God would lead. So we're going to continue on in the training. And I think Dr. Kevin Compton from the Colorado district has a little bit now to say about what it looks like to discover new leaders and ministers. And I will be interjecting some along the way to share some things about how I think this applies to our ministries, and how I think we need to sort of put this into practice. But he does a great job of presenting these concepts.
So, discovering new leaders and ministers. We've got to discover who the new leaders are and who the new ministers are. So, how do we go about doing that? How do we discover leaders that are not yet recognized? First thing up, take time to pray. Pray and process in order to seek leaders that God's calling to meet ministry needs. Now, I don't know how many of you would know it, but our district office is in Springs First Church building. And so I've got the privilege of hanging out with Pastor Mike every once in a while. And the downside of that for you, Pastor Mike, is you wind up being an illustration in my teaching on occasion. So we have these spontaneous staff meetings in the hallway on occasion. We just bump into each other in the hallway. Our offices are right across the hall from each other. And we get to talk about ministry and challenges and celebrate things together just spontaneously, a few minutes at a time. And I remember a couple of years ago, I bumped into him in the hallway, and he was talking about the fact that he had some gaps in the ministry pipeline. He had some gaps in his staff that he needed to fill. And I said, well, what are you doing to fill those gaps? And he said, well, first thing, I'm just praying like crazy that God will bring somebody across my path that I can recognize, that can fill a need, and that God will fill that need. A couple of months later, he introduced me to Pastor Katie, who's also here. They were just walking down the hall together, and I picked up on the conversation. It sounded kind of like a job interview. I don't know that she knew that at the time, but Mike was praying, God bring somebody along. Pastor Katie and her husband moved to Colorado Springs for his job assignment with the military. They were just looking for a church to connect to. Next thing I know, she's on staff, and a year later, we're ordaining her at our assembly. Mike prayed, God answered, and that's how he found the leader that he needed for that. As we're taking time to pray and process, one of the things we have to do is look for ministry blind spots. Look for the leaders that don't even know that you need them. People will respond when you make the need known. People will respond when you say, hey, we've got a need here in the church. Or sometimes you talk to them. You have one of those I see in you conversations that Pastor Mark was talking about. But look for the leaders that don't even know that you need them yet. And then ask God to show you who might fill leadership voids in the church.
Okay, so I'm gonna jump in here for a second, just to share some things with you. Kevin does a really great job of going through a ministry grid here in the training, which is something that we don't have in the current training book. I think we've done some edits and maybe it's been taken out, but the thought that he's trying to express is that sometimes a way to sort of overcome our blind spots or allowing God to work or helping sort of God work in showing you who might fill some of those leadership voids is to make the needs of the church known. And if you don't know the needs, then it's hard to make them known. And so at the end of the last module, we actually did spend some time sort of listing some ministry gaps that are sort of present in our church. And so he suggests that you put the grid with the gaps of leadership up on the bulletin board, which isn't a bad idea, to make them known, because then sometimes leaders sort of self-identify. Now, I think in this training, we want to talk more about how we can change in terms of how we can sort of see our own blind spots, what we might not be able to see, the leaders that we are sort of looking over their heads. I always love to tell the story in Isaiah 6 of the calling of Isaiah when he says, here I am, send me. And I tell it in a way that, so God says, whom shall we send and who will go for us? And it's almost as if, as I read it, I imagine God looking at all the people. And I always say Isaiah was sort of in a place of ministry, but he seemed to be the only one that saw the vision of God's presence there and what God was saying and what God was doing. And so there were many people there, but Isaiah was the one that was listening, that was seeing the movements of God. And yet it seems like God was sort of opening up the call to anybody, and it was Isaiah who responded because he was the one who was listening. And so I wonder if sometimes if we are in the place of God in the story, which is a dangerous place to put ourselves, if it's possible that we're the ones sort of looking over the Isaiah, looking over the person who might who might be the one that God would have, who might be the one who would be willing. And so sort of tuning our eyes to be able to see the people that we're overlooking right now is one way of overcoming a ministry blind spot. Another way is giving them the opportunity to say, "Here I am, send me." So that's what Dr. Compton was talking about with this ministry grid and putting it up on the bulletin board. One example that I think Pastor Mark taught me years ago that I've re-expressed in a visual way to our worship leaders is that if you need a bass player, for instance, if you have a band and you have a keyboard and a vocalist and a guitar and a drummer, but you really want a bass player, we have a tendency not to put any extra instruments on the stage. But I was taught put the bass on the stand on the stage so that somebody in the congregation might say, "I noticed you have a bass sitting on the stage with no one playing it. Do you need somebody to play bass? Because I play bass." And just the visual act of putting that bass on the stage has a tendency to help people in the congregation identify that I think they want a bass player and they don't seem to have one. Maybe I can fulfill that role. And but we as leaders have a tendency to uh, we don't want to look like we're short, so we take all the instruments off the stage. We had a second keyboard on the stage for a long time that I had put on the stage because I want a second keyboard player. And the reason is, if you're musically inclined, it's nice to have sort of a background synth patch available, um, that can bridge the gap between songs and things like that. That can function. An electric guitar player with the right kind of pedals can do the same sort of thing. But I always think we ought to have. That's something that a lot of churches don't use, because they don't have it. You can actually also, if you don't have the people, use an iPad or something. There are things that you can play for that kind of thing. But I put a keyboard on the stage because we had a lot of young, like fifth graders that I was teaching to play keyboard, and I was hoping that one of them would maybe not be able to be yet ready to play the piano, but would be able to play a chord with a synth patch and sort of get started, and we can move somebody into leadership. But if that keyboard sits there long enough with nobody playing it, people just think it looks like clutter on the stage. And so eventually somebody moves that off the stage. It always tends to happen. Let's clean up the stage. Let's make it look less cluttered. But sometimes the things that make sense to us actually work against us raising up leaders in the church because we've cleaned away the clutter, but we've also taken away the one thing that was reminding people that we actually would like a second keyboard player on the stage. So, how do we help overcome our blind spots and be able to see those who we aren't looking at right now, who might be saying, "Here I am, send me"? And also, how do we help them hear the call where if we're saying, "Who should we send? Who do we have that could do this?" That gives them the opportunity to say, "Here I am, send me."
So, discovering new leaders and ministers, we need to discover who the new leaders are, take time to pray, look for blind spots, and fill in that ministry grid. As we're looking for leaders, we need to know what to look for. What characteristics are we looking for in leaders? So, we're going to dig down into a few specifics now. There are some must-have qualities that we want to see in our leaders. And the first of those, we've mentioned it already, spiritual velocity. Velocity is the speed of something in a given direction. When I'm leading a construction site project or a commercial kitchen or a ministry in the local church, I want to look for people that do what the ministry calls moving with a purpose. They're not just being busy and fluttering around, and they're not sitting still, certainly. They're moving at a speed in a particular direction with a mission in mind. That's the kind of person I want to look for to fill a ministry leadership role in the church, whether they're clergy or laity. Somebody that's moving, somebody that's making things happen, somebody that has the capacity to have intentionality in what they're doing. So that velocity is critical. And then teachability. I think teachability is absolutely essential. It's an absolute must-have quality in a leader. Is this person that you're looking at a sponge, or are they a brick wall? Do they absorb information? Do they have a heart of a teacher and the heart of a learner? Are they wanting to grow even if they're already established in what they're doing? Are they still hungry? I'm imagining that the answer would be yes for almost everybody in this room, because you're here. You chose to take a Saturday out of your life and come and learn and be exposed to concepts and fellowship with the other people across the district to learn how to do some of these things, how to identify and fill our leadership pipelines. So you've got a teachable spirit, is my assumption. Find other people that have a spirit like that, plug them in to be leaders in your churches. And then they've got to have some relational intelligence. Another phrase you might be familiar with is emotional intelligence. What in the world is emotional intelligence? I'm not talking about IQ. I'm not talking about how smart somebody is. We're talking about how much they can relate to the people around them, how well they read their environment, and how aware they are of how that environment responds to their leadership. If you go through the Emotional Intelligence book by Travis Bradberry, he kind of breaks it up into 4 quadrants. How aware am I of myself? How aware am I of how I interact with my environment? And then how aware am I of how the environment responds to me? And there's one other category I'm blanking on right now. But do they have that ability to shift and adjust and respond so that they get the response that they're looking for? That's essential in a leader. There are some nice to have qualities. A leader doesn't have to have everything, but if they could have a few extra things beyond the absolute essentials, it's really fantastic. And one of those is a kingdom mindset. Are they missional? Do they think about how we're going to be bringing the people to Jesus through this approach? And do they have more of a mission mindset than a personal agenda? Some people desire to be in leadership, and they're so eager to be in leadership, you're thinking, well, why are they so eager to do this thing that they don't seem to be suited to do? And sometimes there's a personal agenda behind that. So we want to look for folks with that missional mindset, that kingdom mindset, and not the personal agenda. Is this person discerning? Can they apply what they have learned? Can they apply what they know? Do they have wisdom to go along with their knowledge? I had a Messianic Jewish individual in my local church who knew the scriptures inside and out. He could talk to you about the festivals. He could talk to you about the Jewish holidays. He could quote the Hebraic scriptures to you. He could do word studies in the Old Testament and really educate you. He had no capacity to apply that knowledge to his own life. I would get calls from his landlord to ask if I could come over and help get him out of his apartment because he was drunk and he was making noise upstairs above where the landlord lived, who was also in my church. He had no capacity to apply that information to his own life. So are they discerning enough to be able to apply those things? And then finally, or not finally, but next, are they inclusive? Now, inclusivity is a buzzword in our society right now, so I'm not going to pretend that it isn't. I am not talking about justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion like you're hearing in all of the educational literature and other places out there now. I'm not talking about diversity hires and putting people into roles because of what box they check on the diversity checklist. But I'm talking about, do these people have an inclusive spirit that makes them attract more people than they repel? Do they like to include people? When they're trying to get a group of 10 people to come in to do something and the 9th and 10th persons, they're standing on the outside, do they make the extra effort to get them included as well so that we can take a whole group in a particular direction? So an inclusive spirit and an inclusive heart is important. And then finally, biblical knowledge. Now, here's the good news, and I'll ask Dr. Sherwood to not listen to this part. You don't have to have a Bible college degree to be a leader in the church. You don't need a PhD in theology. You don't need a doctor of ministry degree. You don't have to have that level of biblical knowledge to lead. The key is to have enough knowledge to be one step ahead of the people that you're leading.
Okay, so I just want to add just a little bit to what Dr. Compton is saying about knowing what to look for in leaders. It may seem strange to hear from a trainer, a pastor, a district leader that you don't need somebody to have biblical knowledge, or you don't need somebody to be missional. But I think the key to understanding why these are nice to haves and not must haves. So we put them in there in the nice to haves because they are pretty important. There's a lot of things that we might think people need that they don't need at all, like long term history in the church or things like that. But these are nice to haves, but they're not must haves because teachability is the must have. So if you're teachable, then these are things that you can learn. If you're teachable, then somebody can teach you more biblical knowledge, and as long as you have more biblical knowledge than those that you're teaching, or at least you're studying to know more about this topic or this study than those that you're going to teach, it's enough. We had a young lady that we asked to teach a Bible study, and she felt so inadequate because she said, "Well, I haven't read the whole Bible yet." And we all kind of chuckled because the truth is that there's a lot of people in the church and in leadership who haven't read the whole Bible. I hope that we kind of make that a priority as pastors, that we go through some yearly reading plans or something like that and have a basic knowledge of as much of the Bible as possible. But most of us don't have that before we start some form of leadership in the church. But if we're teachable, if we're learning, then that overcomes the stuff that we don't know. There's a humility about that. And I want to really sort of step in a little bit to spiritual velocity, which is very related to teachability. So, spiritual velocity is about how fast and the direction. I'm a math guy. And velocity is what's called a vector, and so it has magnitude and it has direction, and they're especially helpful in physics, but I won't go into that kind of lesson for you. But it has magnitude and direction. So somebody's spiritual velocity can be zero. In other words, they might be what we would consider mature because they've been in the church for a long time or whatever, but their spiritual velocity, and I think this is what it talks about in Revelation in the seven letters when he says you've lost your first love. I wish that you were either hot or cold, but you're lukewarm. Is that there's a lot of people that consider themselves mature believers, and probably the church and the pastors consider them mature believers, but their spiritual velocity is almost zero. So they have no intent to grow any further. They're not driving forward. In fact, in some cases the spiritual velocity might be negative. They may be moving backwards on the line of maturity because honestly I really do think that we stall out and we have a tendency to slide backward if we're not moving forward intentionally. So I have new believers that come into the church sometimes, and we quickly put them into ministries. And some people are like, "Well, I don't understand why you put that person in charge of this or in this ministry when you have this person, this person, this person that are more mature than they are." So we've put. I was teaching a Bible study in our church within 3 months of really having come to the church, and probably within about 9 months of actually making a commitment to Christ. But that 9 month commitment, it was really only when I got to the church in that 3 months that I started understanding holiness and really moving toward a life of holiness. And so I wasn't put into teaching a Bible study because I was so mature. I was put in there because I was anxious to learn, and I had this spiritual velocity. I really believe that. And we've sort of carried forward that tradition in our church where we put some people in positions of leadership and even teaching Bible studies that are very young in their faith, but they're soaking it all in. They're teachable. They're growing fast. Now, here's the dangerous thing, is that some of those people have been put in that position, and then they think, oh, look at me. I've been put in this position. I'm doing well. And they think it's a measure of how far they've come, and they sort of tend to stop growing. So that's the danger of it. And I've also seen in our church somebody who stopped growing and felt really good about their position, and their spiritual velocity was so high that they got put in that position, but then their spiritual velocity became zero while they still sat in that position. And people are like, why are they teaching a Bible study? And that was a reasonable question, and I've asked that question, and we've had to find ways to change some things to stop that from happening. Um, but I will say there are times when a young believer is put in because of spiritual velocity, and there are other people who consider themselves more mature, but they have a spiritual velocity of zero. They're on their phones the whole time during church. They come to as few services as absolutely possible, and you have to beg them to come on a Wednesday night. And you think, these people really don't care about their spiritual growth at all. They think that they're mature enough, so they don't think they need to grow. When I'm looking for leaders in the church, I'm not looking for somebody who already thinks they know it all, who has no interest in growing or learning. I'm looking for the person that can be molded, can be taught, and is anxious about growing, and has a spiritual velocity that not only is positive, it's in the direction we want it to go, but it's also the magnitude is larger than everybody else around them. I've just put some people on the schedule to start helping with our offering collection. Not ushers or counters, but actually somebody to come up and say, "Hey, it's offering time," from the stage, and quote some scripture, share some scripture with us. One, I look for people who are already giving themselves. You can't call others to give if you're not already giving yourself. But two, I put some mature people in the schedule so that they could model it, and then I put some people that are brand new to it, but they're teachable, and their spiritual velocity is in the right direction, and it's pretty big. And so that's what we're talking about here. And I think that's why those are must-haves. Relational intelligence, I could talk for a long time about that, and Dr. Compton talked about emotional intelligence. Sometimes we have leaders that don't understand how to communicate with their people, and don't understand why people are not really understanding what we're saying. We have some of that in our church too, and that is really difficult, and causes challenges, because it doesn't just affect that person, but it affects the people around them. And so that definitely is something that we need to probably be paying a little more attention to than we have in the past. Missional is important. Somebody needs to be missional, but we can teach people about the mission. And I would say it's hard for them to be missional, not to be missional, if they have spiritual velocity. They're going to learn that quick. So uh, let's get back to the rest of the teaching.
So, number three, look in places that you might not expect to find leaders when you're looking for them. Moses was a babbler and a murderer, right? King David, he was an adulterer and a murderer, vicariously at least. Paul was a persecutor of the church, but God made every one of them leaders in the church. They were all laymen at the time, by the way, right? So look for them in places you might not think you would find them. You might find someone outside of your church. A lot of churches have food ministries, food pantry ministries. Most of you probably get some of your food from some sort of community food bank or care and share warehouse, that type of thing. Every once in a while, you might find somebody in that location that knows the Lord, Maybe not like the way we would think they would know the Lord or need to be a leader, but they might be able to help you with your local food pantry ministry. They've already got the skill set. They're already involved in that type of compassionate work. They may not even see it as ministry necessarily, but you could find someone outside of your church that you have a relationship with that could become a part of your team and could help you more fully develop a ministry. So you could disciple them and put them in leadership and grow the church all at the same time if you just get creative and look outside the walls of the church. So number 4, God can use anyone. Do you believe that? When I was a student at Nazarene Bible College, I was very privileged to be on the Student Government Council for the whole 4 years that I was there, which gave me the opportunity to just interact with a lot more students than I normally would have. And every once in a while you would meet a student and you think, oh, bless his heart. And where I'm from, that means something. And it's not great. And they were one of those students that I spent a fair amount of time with, and I thought, Lord, what's your plan here? I don't see gifts. I don't see graces. I'm not sure where this person's going in ministry. I don't know. I hope, just bless his heart, Lord, Just as we were ready to graduate, that student came up to me, shook my hand, and thanked me for my friendship. I didn't realize we'd even been that close. But that prompted me to keep tabs on him after he left. That Lord used that guy to launch a ministry to a group of people that I could never reach, a group that I could never serve effectively, I don't believe. I mean, God can do a lot of things beyond my capacity, but I just don't think I was gifted to do that. And he had a tremendous ministry for several years. We eventually lost track of each other, but I was so impressed with how God used somebody that I didn't think I could understand how they could be used in ministry. But you've got to believe that God can use anyone. Do we really believe that? We've got to give the opportunity for everyone to serve. If somebody wants to serve, find a place for them to serve. Now, you've got to find an appropriate place. We've talked about that already, but find a place for them to serve if they're volunteering. I have had retired folks that were physically disabled, and you just didn't think there was anything that they were going to be able to do effectively. But boy, they could work a registration table at the community barbecue like nobody's business. They made friends, they got contact information, and they witnessed to people, and you just didn't think they were going to have the capacity to do a lot, but they found a way they could plug in and serve. So give everybody the opportunity. Have a blessing, not a permission framework. We're very structured in the Church of the Nazarene, and I kind of like that. I'm a pretty structured guy. I really enjoy that we've got a system, we've got a checklist, we've got criteria, but sometimes you've got to step outside of that to find a creative way for someone to serve, and you've got to bless them to go serve. And again, find an appropriate way for them to do that. But if they want to serve, you've got to have a blessing mindset where you're going to bless them to go and you're going to help them do that. You may have to do some of their training, some of their orientation, but you can find a way for them to serve. We give everyone permission, however, we have differing expectations for different callings. If somebody just wants to jump in and help take the offering, I don't know that we've got to have a real strict criteria for that. But if they want to lead Bible quizzing for our teens, we might have some expectation of maturity and biblical understanding. Now, if they want to do the pastoral counseling and lead communion every month, then there's going to be some clergy criteria attached to that. So we're going to find the criteria that's appropriate, not hold everybody to the same level of training and expectation, but find a way to plug them in where they are. Every person that is called should be trained. Never do ministry alone, right? Training programs don't always have to be formal. Now, if somebody's headed in a more formal ministerial direction, they should stop by and see Dr. Sherwood at the table out there, and they should talk about getting plugged into a ministerial training program. But every person can be trained simply by just shadowing you. Whatever ministry you do, take somebody along and have them do ministry with you. We need to elevate the servant roles to at least the same level that we celebrate more influential roles of ministry. Not every one of us are going to be on the platform on Sunday morning. Not every one of us are going to be on the keyboard on Sunday morning or doing something that is visible on Sunday morning. Not every one of us is going to lead a group. But how many of us would like to have a church that had no nursery workers? Right? How many of us would like to be in a church where there's no custodian? I don't think I would enjoy that very much. How many of us would enjoy being in a church that didn't have a treasurer? We didn't know what happened to the money. We just put it in a plate and it disappears. Right? If that's your church, don't come talk to me. I don't want to deal with that today. Find the people that are doing great commission work and celebrate them. They don't always have a title. They're not always on the platform, but they're touching lives. They're leading people to Jesus. They're making disciples. That's what we need to elevate, is that. And the other things are just supportive to that. So we have to make Great Commission calling the highest calling. Who can tell me what Matthew 28 says, the Great Commission, Matthew 28, 19 and 20? We don't have to read it. Somebody tell me what it's about. Going in to make disciples, and then God promises that he'll be with us. The people that live that out, those are the ones that we want to elevate in ministry. Those are the ones we want to draw attention to. Those are the ones that we want to duplicate. People that are leading other people to Christ. So create a culture of apprenticeship. Pastor Mark mentioned that. Paul and Timothy are the classic example of that. Paul was constantly giving Timothy instruction, giving him responsibility, giving him wisdom. Do that for the people in your church. As you lead, mentor them. And if you're in a place where you need to be mentored, find a leader to connect with. Volunteer to fill one of those gaps in the ministry grid. You might be involved in a ministry and think, well, they've got the ministry. They've already got the leader. I could be that apprentice. I could learn to do that. I love the ministry. I love working with that leader. I could be the person that could fill in and be that apprentice. So find one side of that relationship to be on. Look to a larger list when you're looking for leaders. And the first example we've got here is a membership list. And Pastor Mark mentioned that. And there's a lot of times we need to look at our membership list, but could I challenge you to look beyond that? Kind of the photo idea that Pastor Mark was talking about. Look to your attenders list. Not every leadership position in the church requires that you be a full member of the church. You could just be an active participant in the church, and there are leadership things and ministry involvement that you can do. So when you're looking to fill in that ministry grid, look to your attenders. Look beyond just the formal membership list. Make sure that you include some ladies in some of those leadership roles and some people of different ages in those leadership roles, and some that are not a part of the majority cultural group of your church. If your church is full of 70-year-old white people and you can find somebody other than that, put them in leadership too. And again, I'm not talking about a diversity appointment just because you check a box. Proverbs 11:14 says there is abundance of counselors, there is safety. We're talking about bringing additional perspective so that we can get some of the blinders off and we can see beyond what we see as ministry and we can think on a broader scale, and having diversity of input helps us make better decisions. That's the reason that we do that. Our motivation is a little different than the world as to why we do that, but we still need to do that. Those that are not as committed yet, sometimes people are less committed because we don't recognize their gifting. Capacity is one of my favorite words. When I see capacity in someone to lead, they may not be leading yet, but I'm looking for people that have the capacity to do so. So look beyond just the people that are involved. Look to those that have the capacity to lead and invite them into leadership. So how do we do that to where they don't think that we're calling them, but we're letting God call them? We're just recognizing and affirming that call, as Pastor Mark talked about. Having those I see in you conversations. I want to expand on that a little bit. Give specific feedback when you have those conversations with somebody. Pastor Darren, I see you in the ability to be a great DS someday. I think that's only about 2 weeks away. I'm going to be prophetic in that. Have those kind of conversations, right? Ask if they would pray about a specific need. Sometimes a generic invitation into ministry isn't enough, but it's something specific. I've noticed how much you love Scripture. I see in you the capacity that you might be able to lead our teen quizzing because you love the Scripture, you love reciting it, you love memorizing it, and we want our teens to get the Word of God into their heart too. Would you pray about doing that? And then go back and check up with them in about a week and ask them if they have prayed about it. Let them know you've been praying about it, but then you can have a conversation about what God's saying to both of you to expand that conversation. Invite people to join you and include them in something that you're already doing or leading. I'm going to say it again, don't do ministry alone. Invite somebody to come with you. If you're leading a ministry that's growing, you need additional apprentices. Bring people along with you. Teach them how to do what it is that you're doing. So we want to speak about the call to ministry at all levels on an annual basis. And the notes say from the pulpit. Pastors, that works great for you, but most of us in this room here today are not Sunday morning pulpiteers that have our own pulpit from which we can do that. Can I challenge you to speak from whatever pulpit God gives you? What group of people can you reach out to and talk about call? I get the opportunity every once in a while to talk to a group of pastors. I try to mention the concept of call, filling the pipeline, doing those types of things when I have the opportunity to do that. Just this year at our board of ministry, I talked to our pastors about that as a group. There's about 20 pastors on our district that serve as our board of ministry and interview people that are in the ministerial process. When I get to make reports to the district assembly, I try and highlight that God's still calling people just to plant that seed with them so they might think, yeah, maybe one of these days I could see my name in that report as I answer the call to ministry. So use the pulpit that God gives you to speak about it. Have an annual ministry blitz emphasis in your church. You could take up to a month and spend and emphasize all the different ministries in the church from the pulpit and from those other places that we talked about. Our Pueblo First Church does this really. Is anybody here from Pueblo First? I don't think we have anybody here. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about how they do that here in a minute. So give opportunities for those feeling a leading to respond, and be sure you get their information as a part of this Ministry Blitz event. You know, you could produce a ministry card, response card or something, and can I encourage you to keep that simple? That ought to have 2, 3, 4 questions on it maximum so that they can just make that initial contact with you as the pastor and they can say, I've got an interest in doing this. I've got an interest in serving in this way or starting this ministry, whatever it is, so that you can then follow up with them and have that I see in you conversation.
Okay, so at the bottom of this page, it talks about a series on the calling of God, and I'll just say a couple things. One, I think that a lot of folks that may be in this training with us right now are not pastors, and I think Dr. Compton did a good job of covering that and saying use the pulpit that you have, use whatever platform that you have to encourage people to answer the call to ministry. So if folks within our church are all using the platform that they have to discover new ministers and to remind people to be listening to what God might be saying to them about a call to ministry, whether it be lay or clergy, then we will. Then the culture in our church for uh, calling will not be just promoted by the pastor. It'll be promoted by every member of the church who has used their platform to look for those who might be called to ministry. One of the most difficult things as a pastor is when there's a ministry opening or a need, and the pastor's the one that has to fill it, and the pastor's the one that has to find the folks to fill those ministry needs. But it's possible that the people that are ready to fill those ministry needs aren't necessarily in settings where I see them all the time, but they may be volunteering in our food bank and resource center, and I don't even necessarily see them on Sunday, but you see them every week. And if you're not looking for them, then and you're not using sort of your platform to remind them about God's calling, then we're not going to have that culture sort of pervasive throughout our church. We're just going to have it sort of maintained as best we can from the pulpit, from me. And so that's one of the reasons we're actually going through this training with our local church is not just, and by the way, I am preaching a series on this, on not exactly these four Sunday topics, but I am preaching a series. We are going through this training in our Bible studies for 4 weeks, and we're doing all that because we want to maintain that. I will say this, that when something becomes actually within the culture, sort of actually ingrained within the culture, then it becomes something that comes out uh, every week in the message or every week through the Bible studies rather than just, and I think maybe we less need a 4 week emphasis at some point during the year. And I think that that's part of the development of a culture is sometimes we do need somebody to remind us of something to for something to be cultural, become cultural in our church. And sometimes we do need an emphasis Sunday or an emphasis month to keep something sort of prominent in our culture. But also I do believe that as long as we have to have that, it is a signal that we do not yet have that culture. And so that is intended to create that culture, but it's also a signal that we don't have it. And so once that becomes cultural within our church, then we don't need a Sunday to talk about the calling of God, because regularly it's part of our culture. We're talking about the calling of God in Bible studies and on Sundays, and we don't have to have one week where we say it, because it's, you know, maybe at least 26 weeks out of the year, we're saying something about it. Maybe it's all 52 because it's such a part of our culture. So, one of the things that this training is designed to do is to create a culture, which means, yes, we need to start talking about the calling of God. And perhaps if we see that culture sort of waning a little bit, we need to do a re education time. We need to spend some weeks in that to remind people what it looks like to have this culture of calling. But in the long run, this should be a part of everything that we do. So I'll say this. Our church, for our membership class, we have a packet that we call them our step studies, but the first packet is Know Your Church. And it's a little bit about the Church of the Nazarene, and that we've had that for years. In fact, I was teaching it when I was on staff, more or less. What became the packet, what became the curriculum that we used, was what I was already teaching without curriculum. I had sort of been developing it a little bit at a time. But a few years ago, God led me to sort of continue those packets, and to create a second packet called Know Your Role. And Know Your Role is about our role as members once we become members, and it's about getting actively involved in ministry as a layperson, and what it looks like to get plugged into ministry. And then Know Your Call is the third packet, and it's about really trying to process um, a call to ministry that's specific, that's not just sort of getting involved in the church as a faithful and active member, but it's about finding a specific call, even if that's to a specific lay ministry or to a pastoral ministry. So it's ingrained in our culture, at least in part, because we don't want people to stop at learning what it means to be a member and what the Church of the Nazarene is about. We want people that are onboarding, sort of coming into our church, to learn all of that. We are making those packets available through Discipleship Place in an online format with videos. We have some videos up right now, but we're still working on sort of getting those finalized in a better format that's easier. They will be available on our app, and we're going to have this awesome opportunity, perhaps once you finish this training, to go into those learning environments and get deeper about your specific call. Okay, so like all lessons in this series, in this training, we're going to be doing some discussion. And so it says in our packet, break up into groups of 3 or 4. If you're already in a small group environment, this should be pretty easy. If you're in a larger group, go ahead and break up into smaller groups. If you're watching this video online and kind of doing this training in an individual format, I want to recommend that again you find a mentor, a discipler, a accountability partner, a friend to discuss these things with, to make sure that this part sort of, this is kind of the application of it. It's easy to learn, but let's process what we've learned and think about what it looks like in our ministry and in our setting in our church. And so that's what this is about. In those groups, there's 3 questions, and it says share your first sense of calling all the way through to your confident assurance of that call. So let me just say that our first sense of calling is almost never immediately results in a confident assurance. In fact, there's often some processing that is required where we hear the call of God and we're like, I think I just heard the call of God, and we go talk to somebody, and maybe we don't listen at first, but we hear that call of God again, and in a new way, in a different way that sort of reaffirms that. And so it takes us time to sort of process that and become more and more confident. Sometimes that even happens more and more as we prepare for the ministry that we are called to, that God reaffirms it as He shows us the gifts and graces that we didn't even realize we had, that we didn't see at first. But as we begin to learn, we say, oh, actually, I think I'm good at that. And God just continually reaffirms it. So maybe you haven't got to a confident assurance of your call yet, but one of the reasons this is good to discuss in groups is if you've got that first sense of calling and maybe you're not there yet, but you talk in a group and somebody else can show you their process. They were first called and now they have a confident assurance of that call. Then you can say, oh, I'm on this path and God has not sort of abandoned me on this path. He has a plan to get me to that confident assurance. And maybe I need to follow the preparation steps, respond to the first call in order to continue to get to that place. The second one says, mention mentors and leaders who have helped inspire you to respond to your call. There are almost always mentors and leaders in our life that have spoken into our life and helped us process our call and helped us, encouraged us to respond to that call. And so let's talk about that. Number three, describe how others influenced you to confirm your calling. What kinds of things did they say to you? What kinds of questions did they use to move you in the journey? What actions did they take to move you along the journey? And let me just say that all of us are on that journey. So as we share, then it will be helpful for one another. But also, as we share, we will start to realize the things that we need to do in order to be helpful in somebody else's journey. So, wherever you're at on the journey, if you have a calling and you've become confident in that calling, you know what was necessary for you to get to that place. And this will help you encourage somebody else on their journey.